I saw something earlier today in Twitter that brought to mind some matters that I'd wanted to do a Sadler Stories narrating, talking about, having to do with my mom and cooking, and a few other things as well. And the Twitter post was somebody who was talking about cooking as a hobby for them. And I remember reading it and almost wanting to respond and, thinking, oh, wow, cooking. It is a hobby for many people. It sure isn't a hobby for me, even though I do a lot of cooking and even some baking as well, and other types of food production. And I have, really since I was a kid. There's a different sort of attitude, a different sort of mindset for it to be a hobby, something that you could or couldn't do, something that's, you might say, it brings value to your life, but is essentially extra. It's on top of things. For me, the way that I grew up, cooking was something that we experienced and got involved with nearly every day. And of course, we ate, we enjoyed, we devoured the results of it as well. And I suppose in some respects, my childhood could be said to have been rather privileged in that we had this opportunity. When I say we, I mean myself and my sister, both of us adopted into the Sadler family. And we kind of got the best of both worlds because both my dad and his family and my mom and her family not only had a vast repertoire of dishes and body of knowledge about cooking and baking, and made it, not necessarily in my dad's case a daily practice, but certainly in my mom's case for much of my childhood. And a lot of people don't grow up like that, but I also grew up in a neighborhood where people cooked as well. And so, you take that sort of thing for granted, and it had a massive formative effect on me. So I better start at the start. My mother's side of the family, the Lemreses, they came out of Chicago. There's a whole long story there that I won't go into. My mom grew up on 50th and Halsted, which was kind of a poor neighborhood, and they were working class. She eventually did go to college, although she dropped out to marry my dad. And, most of the family were tradespeople of various sorts or just workers. And so it was just taken for granted that you didn't eat a lot at restaurants. As a matter of fact, this is a bit of a digression, but my uncle, Aim, used to complain, as did my Uncle John, about the fact that when my grandfather would drive them from Chicago all the way up to Quebec to go visit relatives, because cheap vacations, you stay with family, right? They would stop at a restaurant, and my grandpa would make them all decide to order the same thing because he thought it would be quicker. He was the one sole driver, and so he wanted to get the hell back on the road right away. And, of course, it doesn't make it go any quicker. The cook cooks what they cook. And Uncle Aim used to get upset about this because you go to a restaurant, you don't eat what everyone else is eating, unlike every other day in the Lemre's household. But, everybody, either knew somebody who cooked or cooked themselves because that's how you, saved money. And that's how you knew what your food was like. And so it was just kind of an expected thing in my mom's childhood and this vast bunch of Francophone people living on that block. Many of them related to each other, all part of this vast Lemre's clan. My dad grew up in a more privileged situation in the suburb of Arlington Heights, And, in part because his dad, who came from a family that was poor as hell, had worked his way up in corporate America. He was at one time a major consultant for the Glidden Corporation, then he retired. And so he had, plenty of money, married my grandma, Anne, and then they had my dad. So they lived a kind of middle class to upper middle class lifestyle. And grandma was a great cook. As a matter of fact, she was such a good cook that, and she was beloved by the Lemrees family, that there were dishes that she would make that my mom's family would actually beg her to make because she was so good. And she would make a fruit cake at Christmas. People joke about fruit cakes. Her fruit cake was supposedly like the best that anybody had had, and it wasn't like others. I remember her making these wonderful poppy seed cakes, and we would just always eat well. And so that was in both of my parents' backgrounds. My dad was a great grill cook. He would cook steaks and ribs and all sorts of other things like that. He worked very hard, but on weekends he would often cook for us and make us pancakes and eggs and things like that at breakfast. And it was just sort of taken for granted that, hey, if you want to eat something, cook it, right? Or somebody will cook it. Because my dad, while he was alive, working here in Milwaukee, while we were living way out in the sticks, had a really, good job as a tax attorney and as an accountant for a while. My mom didn't have to work, although she did moonlight a little bit working at JCPenney's. She could be home much of the time in our house on Glacier Pass, and she used a considerable portion of that time to make just wonderful meals. And part of that was stuff that she'd learned, from her mom and from my aunt Therese, who we all called Tunny. She and Uncle Hubert were my grandfather's brother and grandmother's sister, and they were sort of like the grandpa and grandma or extra mom and dad to everybody else in the family. And Aunt Tunny was just an amazing cook. There were dishes that she made for us that we lost the recipe to and then found the recipe, and thank God, like our Tootsie Eye, our meat pie that we have. And so my mom learned, from some of the best, not fancy cooking, but sort of like how to do things at home with whatever it is that you have. And everything was made from scratch. I mean, there were occasions where maybe somebody would buy a cake mix or something like that. But in general, it was sort of a no-brainer. You knew how to cook. You had the ingredients. It's cheaper to cook from scratch. You know exactly what's going into it. Why wouldn't you just do it that way? So that's what she did. And she would make just amazing meals day after day after day, and great desserts. But it wasn't that unusual in the neighborhood that we grew up in. I remember, next door to us were the Scafitos, and sometimes the grandma, Mrs. Scafito's mom, would stay with them. And holy crap, the sauces she would make with Italian sausage and pig's feet and stuff like that. All sorts of other people would make other dishes, and it was quite common to share things back and forth, to have parties where there was lots of great food. My dad would grill out on the deck when he had time and make, as I said, ribs and steak and things like that. Back then ribs were actually quite cheap, so they knew how to take things. And I remember, some of my earliest memories of living there are helping my mom out, peeling potatoes, peeling carrots, cutting things up, prepping. She taught us how to break down chickens. And we would also, at that time, we would buy an entire cow and store it in a freezer in the basement. And then we pull this meat out and thaw it and cook it and do all sorts of things. And my mom, she thought, to her credit, she thought it was really important that me and my sister not just learn how to cook some really basic things, but learn as much as we could about how to make dishes properly. And that's what we in fact did. It was just sort of taken for granted that, you want to eat this sort of thing, learn how to make it. And what a gift in retrospect she gave me by doing that. And it wasn't just her. There was also, Grandma and Aunt Honey. Grandpa would make oyster stew, sort of a legacy of the family, having lived out in New England for a long time, really up until the 1930s when they all moved to Chicago. And you just kind of pick these things up. She also taught me how to use recipes, but also how to modify recipes, what to substitute, how to think it through. And a lot of cooking is actually that. It seems like it's kind of a mundane task, doesn't require a lot of brain power, but actually being able to figure out what's going into a dish and what you can substitute and what you can do and what you can add and what you can take out, that actually is quite important. Perhaps even more these days when a lot of the foods that we eat, we talk about processed foods or foods coming out of boxes. In the 1970s when I was a kid, a lot of the stuff that was processed wasn't good for you, but it wasn't as bad for you as it is now. And, after my dad died and my mom had to go back to work, a lot more of the cooking fell onto my sister and me. My mom would do things like batch cooking, making a ton of chili, storing it out in the garage in the winter, and we'd go, make the macaroni and grate the cheese and go get the chili and heat it up and put it all together to make chili mac or pick whatever else you wanted. My mom used to make some pretty awesome spaghetti sauces as well. And my mom never stopped making desserts, though. She would make these amazing mousses, not just chocolate, but strawberry, pineapple, all sorts of other things as well. And if there was ever a need for a cake, she'd just kind of whip it up. And she taught us how to, not just how to do these things, but how to learn, how to think these culinary matters through. And so, I was actually quite fortunate in that, because when I lived on my own, I could take care of myself. I could go to the store, get everything I needed, menu plan for a week, for 2 weeks. It was really handy when I wanted to impress, a date or potential girlfriend, or have a bunch of friends over, or go to a party. I wound up, having sort of a specialization in making Bavarian creams and mousses and things like that. And, when I lived on my own, I could live so cheaply because I could go to places, get everything that I needed. If something happened to fall into my lap, somebody's like, hey, I've got a bunch of zucchini. You want it? Or here's some tomatoes. Or I would, forage around and pick blackberries or black raspberries, or, I had a relative who had a persimmon tree, and I could go on and on and on and on, right? I could live pretty cheaply just by cooking healthy, tasty meals for myself and whoever else I was involved with. And that's actually a really great thing. I'm also super fortunate in that I've got a wife who similarly grew up in a house where people cooked from scratch, and who actually worked for more than 10 years at the Culinary Institute of America, where it's, that's sort of the Harvard of culinary schools. The French chefs send their kids there, and so there's lots of great lore and knowledge and, interesting frou-frou things that could be brought to the table as well. But she and I both enjoy doing fairly basic, healthy, tasty food, and we do it all the time. Just in the last couple days, she roasted a chicken. She made a great soup. I took the chicken. I've got all the meat off of it. Made 5 quarts of stock from it. One of which will be used for a soup that will have chicken and carrots and onions and celery and cabbage in, later on this week, I'm going to start making some more biscotti since we're almost out of the biscotti that I made. And I could just go on and on and on. That is our day-to-day life. That's the way that we live. We cook things up for ourselves, and we know what's going into it. And we experiment, we modify, we tinker around sometimes, because we can think our way, not just taste our way or work our way, but think our way through the food. And for me, the person who that is the most attributable to is my mother. But she had it because of all these other people, and I was fortunate enough to have so many other people just routinely involved in my life who do good cooking. So for me, it's not a hobby. Cooking and baking is kind of an integral part of my life. It's something that helps me, when I'm cooking a particular dish, to have something to do with my hands, something I can bring to other people and fill my own belly with. But it also connects me to these people that are, in most cases, long gone. My mom, my grandma, Aunt Honey, my dad, other people, who I learned recipes from here and there, or a technique from here and there. And over time, of course, I've learned a lot more. Things have expanded. My repertoire of recipes has become quite extensive. But I've also figured out what it is that I like. And it's not too complicated or too expensive for me to put in the little bit of time and work, actually sometimes not just a little bit of time, but time and work required to make good food and to enjoy it, particularly with my wife and every once in a while with other people as well. So I think there's a lot more I could say about cooking, cuisine. Maybe I'll do that in other Sadler's stories going forward. But I just wanted to, reflect on this a bit. I've been thinking a lot about my mom lately and, the person she was and what she gave me and my sister as we grew up with her, living out in, the border of Delafield and Wales on Glacier Pass, and then in Waukesha, and then in other places. And I've really been fortunate to have somebody who valued food and cooking and the knowledge that is involved with it, and, an appreciation for all sorts of cuisines, and an eagerness, a hunger, pun intended, for learning about this absolutely central aspect of human life. So, that's the story for today. Probably tell you some more stuff about other culinary, baking, cooking, eating things down the line.